Sam Howe Verhovek is a former national correspondent for the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. He has been writing for newspapers since high school and was editor-in-chief of the Sanford Daily during his senior year of college. After graduation, he was hired by New York Times columnist and editor James Reston for a one-year clerkship to serve as Mr. Reston's assistant in the Washington Bureau. He also worked as a reporter for the Asahi Evening News in Tokyo and as a journalism teacher in Beijing before returning to the New York Times as a Metro reporter in New York. Melissa Tizon is the widow of late Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Alex Tizon. Trained as a journalist, Melissa is the vice president of national communications for Providence, one of the largest health systems in the US. She has lived in Seattle for more than 20 years. Sam is the editor of Alex Tizon's post-hominous book, Invisible People, Stories of Lives at the Margins, which is the subject of this evening's presentation. Please join me in welcoming Sam Howe Verhovek and Melissa Tizon.
April 1, 2017. That was the date of my husband's funeral. I don't remember much about that day. It was a total blur. But what I do remember, like it was yesterday, was Sam Howe Verhovek coming up to me. He said, "Don't throw anything away. Let's preserve his work and do something with it for the kids and the nieces and nephews." A few weeks later, Sam called to talk about what we might do exactly. More than anything, I wanted to capture my husband's body of work in an anthology for posterity, and also so the next generation of journalists could study it and learn from it. In 1997, my late husband, Alex Tizon, became one of the first Filipino Americans to win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. He spent his entire career writing about marginalized people, immigrants, Native Americans, outcasts. You see, Alex believed every person had an epic story, and through journalism, he brought people out of the shadows. He gave them a voice. In his 2015 memoir, Big Little Man, Alex wrote, "So I guess you could say I've written a lot about one thing as a journalist, but I hardly ever saw it exclusively about race. To my mind, it was more about telling stories of people who existed outside the mainstream's field of vision, invisible people, barely discernible beings who lived among us, sometimes right next door, who moved through life largely unseen because their stories were largely untold." He went on to say, my own lifelong sense of feeling invisible somehow became useful through journalism. I developed the sensory apparatus to apprehend fellow invisibles, in making them seen even just for a few column inches on a Sunday morning. I had found a purpose. The year Alex died, he wrote what would be his last epic story. It was the story of his beloved Lola. Lola is the Filipino word for grandmother, but you see, she wasn't his actual grandmother. Her name was Eudocia Polido, and she was a domestic worker who came to America with his family in the 1960s. She worked to the bone. In the essay, Alex wrote, "No other word but slave encompassed the life she lived. Her days began before everyone else woke and ended when we went to bed. She prepared 3 meals a day, cleaned the house, waited on my parents, and took care of my 4 siblings and me. My parents never paid her, and they scolded her constantly. She wasn't kept in leg irons, but she may as well have been. It was a deep shame he lived with all his life. He loved Lola more than his own mother. And this story was his way of honoring her, as well as shining a light on the issue of human trafficking and domestic servitude that is so pervasive throughout the Philippines and around the world. The same day Alex died, The Atlantic magazine was trying to get a hold of him to let him know they were finally going to publish the Lola story. He wasn't alive to see it hit the newsstands, but I don't think even he would believe how many hearts he would touch with it. In 2017, My Family's Slave was the most read story on the internet in the entire world. Lola's life struck a chord. Her story is one of the essays that we included in Alex's anthology. And this anthology, Invisible People, would not have been possible without Sam Verhovek serving as editor and pulling it all together. Sam and Alex worked together at the LA Times, and I am so grateful for him for taking this idea and making it real. It was a true labor of love. Only a good friend would do this for another. And to Sam's lovely wife, Lisa Verhovek, I want to say thank you as well for surely providing the moral support behind the scenes. And Dave Boardman, a longtime editor at the Seattle Times, you were instrumental in getting this published through Temple University. Thank you for going to bat for this project. I can't thank you and the team at Temple enough. The book is a collection of 24 of Alex's best essays and stories. Each one is introduced by various editors, reporters, and other colleagues who worked with Alex. To everyone who contributed to this book, thank you. I'm sure Sam gave you an impossibly short word count, but you packed so much into every word. And you have given our family an incredible gift. To offer a sense of how much this means to us, I want to share something from our daughter, Dylan. She wrote, I've been struggling with how to articulate how much this book means to me. I mean, a collection of my dad's most meaningful work with insights from former colleagues and friends who knew slices of him that I didn't or couldn't. Old friends and people who sat next to him at work, exchanged personal emails, gutted fish with him when he was my age, had their own personal relationships with him, and felt the energy I felt too when I looked him in the eye, one that made me feel celebrated for being real, raw, and imperfect. I think that captures beautifully how all of us Tizons feel. And finally, since journalism is driving such a divisive narrative these days, I want to close with this question that Alex often asked. How can we use the power of the media to elevate our understanding of the humanity within one another? As Alex once said, what if saving journalism really has more to do with new models of storytelling, ones that help people get up in the morning and live consciously rather than making people more afraid or resigned and want to stay asleep? A good start, he said, is simply by asking, might there be a better way to tell the story, a way to tell it that contributes meaningfully to hope, healing, and reconciliation? And with that, I want to turn it over to the editor of this book, Sam Howe Verhovek.
Thank you, Melissa. I have to say, I'm very sort of choked up by that last quote where he talked about new models of storytelling and new models of reporting, new models of presenting it to people. If he were here, he'd be a pioneer in that field. He was sort of just beginning to experiment with it in a way, and that makes it all the tougher that he's not here. I wanted to pick up on something that you referenced going back to the day of his service. I was very struck by, there was quite a number of kids there, young girls and boys, and all of them talked about how much they loved their goofy Uncle Alex and how much they were going to miss him. What a funny guy he was, how he never talked down to them. He was always willing to get down to their level, literally get down on the floor and play with them. And I was obviously touched by this, but I also sort of found myself thinking, boy, when they get older and they can really appreciate it, they really should have some way of accessing Alex's work. And so the original sort of, idea was not even necessarily a book. It was just like, we got to pull something together for friends and family. But then as I started to work on it, and, the first thing was to really decide what stories we should preserve. We spent a lot of time talking about that. And it was hard to winnow it down actually just to those 24. But the more that I did that, the more that I thought this really could be a book. And then I began to think this really should be a book. And we were fortunate that Dave Boardman, who was the executive editor of the Seattle Times for many years and was Alex's boss, I didn't even need to say a word to Dave about the book. Once he knew that the idea was a collection of Alex's work, David totally went to bat for it, and it did wind up published by Temple University Press. I will say, on a slightly lighter note, I hope this is okay, Melissa, to say this, but I've since that book was published, I've had a couple of other friends ask me, journalist friends, "Hey Sam, if I die, will you do a book of my work?" And generally, I've said no to people because, and here's why. In my view, Alex's work was truly unique. I mean, every journalist can claim that their body of work is unique, but Alex literally was the person who would zig when everybody else was zagging. And the last thing he would look for is the most obvious story to tell. He liked the story that nobody was telling. And he was drawn to the quietest people in the room and the most marginalized people in our, society. And this is who he was driven to write about. And he did believe, as you referenced, that every single human being has an epic story within them. And he felt that his job was sort of to try to bring it out. He also, I think he told you at one point, trying to remember the quote, it was somewhere between the burden of the subject's, was it desires?
Yeah,
What was it again?
Yeah, it's the tangle of the subject's burden and the subject's desires. That's where your story is.
The tangle, right, between the burden and the hopes and wishes of the person, and that really fit so many of the stories that we chose. So the next thing was starting out thinking, well, it should be chronological. That's the way a lot of anthologies of writers' works are, and there's something to be said for that because you can sort of see the development of the writer, as it were. But in Alex's case, it seemed to make a lot more sense to group the stories by the kinds of people that he wrote about. He was very attracted to loners. He was attracted to eccentrics and oddballs. He was attracted to immigrants and telling their stories. Again, people who are often overlooked. He liked people who were sort of pushing unlikely crusades. I thought it was interesting that when I looked to whether he had ever written about politicians, the stories that I found, I can say this, first of all, Alex hated writing about politics, which sort of made us good colleagues because I actually kind of like politics. So I was happy to do those stories. And he was delighted that I was willing to do them. He thought that covering politicians in a way is sort of the thing that he would be least interested in doing. They're the sort of loudest voices among us in a way. They sort of have to be. And a lot of politics sort of unfolds according to kind of a prearranged script in a way, and that didn't interest him. But it turned out that he had written an absolutely fantastic profile of two of the longest shot candidates for president. I can't remember which cycle it was, but it was Ron Paul and then Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska. And both of them had not a whisper of a prayer of becoming president, and yet they carried on this, crusade and got on the plane every day and went to the rally and all that. And Tizon was just really kind of curious about what made them tick and why they would do this. He also wrote a fabulous story, the other one he wrote for The Atlantic, about the really striking number of people who go missing in Alaska, literally missing and never found. And he found the perfect sort of subject around which to tell this story. It's a story that unfolds over many years. And he was just fascinated by how that person sort of fell off the map, literally. And one of the stories that we're going to discuss tonight, the Surfers for Jesus in Hawaii, it turned out when we were discussing them, that was a personal favorite for both you and me. What I loved about that story, it's about a group of surfers in Hawaii that are sort of misfits, that are sort of, some are former homeless people, some have sort of had a hard time kind of working out anywhere else in society. So they wind up in a beach in Hawaii, but they are also missionaries. They proselytize for Jesus. And I remember when he first told me he was going to do this story, like sort of 99.9% of other journalists, I confess on myself, I thought, oh, this sounds like a really funny story. Like, what a great gag in a way. Like, that's so sort of weird and just humorous. And the thing about Alex is that he never made fun of any of his subjects. He wasn't out to mock them or ridicule them. He wanted to understand them. And he went and he hung out with these surfers for Jesus. And he came back with a really remarkable story. Yes, it had humor in it, but he really treated them with respect. And he really tried to understand where they were coming from and why they were doing what they were doing. And it's a remarkably effective story for that very reason. And I'm delighted that it's, in the anthology. The one other thing I want to say about the way that that the book came together is that we did decide, boy, wouldn't it be great if each story could be introduced by either an editor of Tizon's or a colleague of his, or just somebody who had worked with him. And each person who wrote an introduction, the only thing I asked was that it somewhere in there you point to some either kind of epiphany or element of skill or some anecdote or something in the story that Tizon had brought to bear that made it so effective. And the thing that was remarkable about these essays is they came in and they were all different in a way. They all managed to get at different facets of Tizon's skills, and they're really quite beautiful to read. And I'm delighted that that's the way that the book finally, was laid out, that each piece is introduced by somebody like this. And the other thing we should say is this book is a labor of love on your part and my part. And it's a book for which the biggest hope that you have and that I have is that some young writers are going to read this book and are going to say, I want to be like Alex Tizon. I want to be the next Alex Tizon. And that would mean the most to you and mean the most to me. I'm also glad that we're donating all the proceeds from the book, yours and mine, to the Asian American Journalists Association, who have a scholarship fund. And I can't think of a better place for that money to go.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. So what we wanted to do next is just dive into 4 of Alex's stories and just have a conversation around that. And I think that we should probably start with his epic story, the one that, just really struck such a chord around the world. We would be remiss if we didn't start with that one. So we're gonna just kick it off talking about My Family's Slave. And I wanna, I think I'm just gonna go ahead and read just the first paragraph, just because the way that Alex wrote his leads were always so fascinating. So let me just grab that here. I know you guys can see it. Hold on a second. I'm sorry that I'm a little, need to move something. Okay, so it starts with, the ashes filled a black plastic box about the size of a toaster. It weighed 3.5 pounds. I put it in a canvas tote bag and packed it in my suitcase for the transatlantic flight to Manila. From there, I would travel by car to a rural village. When I arrived, I would hand over all that was left of the woman who had spent 56 years as a slave in my family's household. And, you know, he goes on to tell just an incredible story from the standpoint of him going back to the Philippines after his beloved Lola had died. She died in 2011, and Alex went back in 2016 to bring her ashes to his family. And the whole story unrolls from there. It's incredible in that this piece was a 7,000 words, and in an era where, you know, we look for clickbait and just really fast reads. This was a story that used a lot of words, but it just read like so easily and so beautifully. And people around the world had comments about how they picked it up and they couldn't put it down. Like they just couldn't stop reading it. And it just really speaks to his ability to tell stories in just such a compelling way, kind of going back and forth between, you know, his family in the Philippines, his grandfather, and then, you know, here in the United States, just kind of just traversing all of that. It was just such an incredible story. And, you know, obviously there was a lot of controversy around the story where, you know, just because it talked about someone who was enslaved, and there should be controversy around it. But it also just really struck a chord with so many. So Sam, what are your thoughts about this story?
So one thing I'd say about the controversy, such as it was, there were some people that immediately came out and criticized Alex and said, how could you possibly, you know, have lived with a slave, when the whole point of his story was that it took him many decades to conclude that that was actually what she was. But some of the criticism was sort of so quick and so over the top that I became really convinced that a lot of those people hadn't actually read the story. I think if you sit down and read the story from beginning to end, it's long, it'll take you a while, but you read it from beginning to end and think about it, I think it becomes less an issue of who to blame and who to criticize than a much sort of broader kind of sociological and historical question about how this happened. Because Lola's story, in one sense, was not unusual. She was sort of a stand-in for many, many people that have had that experience. So,
yeah, and you know, so this was the last story that he wrote, and you know, I didn't even think about it as, you know, it didn't even occur to me that it could be controversial. Because I had really looked at it as a tribute to Lola's life. It was a way for Alex to honor this woman who was so important to him. So you know, I was just incredibly surprised when I found out, like when I heard kind of the backlash around it. But it, you know, so it wasn't what I expected. And I think I'm still kind of coming out of the fog of it all. It's been 4 years.
yeah.
And I'm just suddenly able to kind of see things more clearly.
You know, that story, it's a love story. Alex loved Lola. Lola loved him, loved his siblings. It's also a crime story in a way. What happened to her by, our standards, any standard of human decency was not, fair, was not right. And yet the conundrum that was sort of at the heart of it was, even when she was in a position to be freed, and Alex said, you can do anything you want and go anywhere and do whatever you want, she wanted to stay with you guys. That was her family, and there was genuine love there. And so that's what, part of what made the story very complicated.
Yeah. And I think another part of it too that people related to is just this notion of shame, and that every family has secrets and shames that they live with through their adult life. And, obviously not many would have this particular instance that they could relate to, but just universally, I think there is something about families and kind of what they're hiding behind the scenes. I think another thing about this story is that you see how all of Alex's other stories, everything else that he did in journalism, really led up to this, because there are themes in his other works that you really see here. Just kind of the whole idea of immigrants coming here with dreams and and those dreams being dashed. You see that throughout the anthology. So it's just really interesting to see him put all of that together, and just kind of like his whole life, he was like kind of searching for going back to his homeland and really understanding the Philippines. And this last trip that he took, taking Lola's ashes, and this story really is kind of reconciling that gap, between the Philippines and here in the US. So should we move on to the next story?
Yeah, do you want to do the excerpt from the book, or do you want to do The Death of a Dreamer? Why don't you do The Death of a Dreamer, since that sort of picks up wonderfully from the point you were just making about sort of dreams dashed.
Yeah. So Death of a Dreamer is a story about a Filipino woman, Susanna Blackwell, and she was raised in Batangan in the Philippines, and she grew up there, and she had struck up a pen pal relationship with a gentleman here in Seattle in the United States, and they ended up getting married. She came to the United States just with really big dreams about what this would mean for her. Her story ended so tragically. For those of you who've been in Seattle for a while, you may remember a shooting in the King County Courthouse. Susanna Blackwell, she was planning to divorce her husband, a victim of domestic violence. She was planning to divorce him, and he came to the courthouse and shot her and other victims that day. And this was the murder in the courthouse that led to metal detectors at the courthouse. We didn't have that before, but after this, it really changed that. So this story was just really a turning point for Alex. It was, the time that he really started kind of bridging. He had been to the Philippines before, but this story is one where he really just started bridging those, like the dream of people coming to the United States, but finding tragedy. And the writer who did the intro and the anthology for this piece is Terry McDermott, who's an author and a journalist. And he said that this story was really the turning point in Alex's career as a journalist. It was the one that really marked his maturity as a writer and just the levels that he was able to take the writing. And I know you guys can all read this, but even Alex's leads, every single story that he wrote, he began them all so beautifully. And, this one I think is just amazing throughout, but it's the first two paragraphs are, there's no sign marking the entrance to the cemetery. It isn't necessary. Everyone here knows where it is. At the end of a long, muddy trail, it just appears, a city of tombstones in the middle of a mango grove. Susanna Blackwell's tomb is a simple block of concrete about elbow high. There's a man resting an elbow on it right now. It's Susanna's father, Zucchino Remarada. He's 65 with sweat on his forehead and thick, knotty fingers that have spent a lifetime grasping tools. He spends his days here building a cover for Susanna's tomb. So, that just really sets the stage for just an incredible story. And then I think, the other thing I want to mention is one of the things that came out of this story and the way that it was told in the whole situation, honestly, is there is a domestic violence organization here in the Seattle area that was founded, all because of this. It's the organization called API Chaya. So it's just, amazing to me, the impact that telling these stories can have on changing lives for people in the future.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Any thought, or do you want to just jump to the next story, Sam?
Yeah, let me do a brief thing from his memoir, Big Little Man, In Search of My Asian Self. It's a remarkable book that is largely a memoir, but really is sort of more broadly about what it means to be an Asian American, and what it means sort of culturally for Alex growing up. He was obviously trying to forge an identity as an immigrant, as an outsider. And I think, I'm obviously not Asian American, but I think a lot of Asian Americans have this funny experience of being classified in this broad group, which includes people from, literally half the world. And, it's not that people in China don't necessarily have everything in common with people from Japan or from Indonesia or from, any other Asian nation. So it's a lot about that. And let me just read a little bit here. And he's writing this he's referring to being in New York City where they were living. He was going to school in the Bronx. This is probably about when he was in junior high school that he's describing. I knew the mythology was a sham. I had lived too many secret moments in which I felt iron within me. So I began keeping files, figurative files in my head, but also actual file folders with headings such as, quote, Great Orientals, and, quote, Asians in the News, and, quote, Oriental versus Asian, scribbled in big Sharpie letters. Whenever I ran across anything fileable related to Asians, in particular pertaining to race and manhood and power and sex, I would make a note and tuck it away in one of these folders. What's in those? One of my little sisters asked. Files, I said cryptically. Of what? Top secret information, I said. Sometime after Lisa and Rosemary, I started a file, one of my first, labeled simply Orientals. Inside went notes and newspapers or magazine clips, anything that made reference to the word. After a while, I had to create subfiles. So large was this universe of things called Oriental. Roots, rugs, religions, noodles, hairstyles, hoards, healing arts, herbs and spices, fabrics, medicines, modes of war, types of astronomy, spheres of the globe, schools of philosophical thought, and salads. It applied to men, women, gum, dances, eyes, body types, chicken dishes, societies, civilizations, styles of diplomacy, codes of behavior, fighting arts, sexual proclivities, and a particular kind of mind. Apparently, the Orient produced people with a singular way of thinking. And it goes on from there, but it's just it's a remarkable book. And as I said, there's a lot of pathos in the book, but there's also a lot of humor as well. And then we had one other to read from briefly, and that is the Surfers for Jesus story.
Oh, yeah. Well, before we jump to that one, I just wanted to say a little bit about Big Little Man, the overall memoir itself, because when that book first came out, the thing that the media really glommed onto was the chapter about the penis size of Asian American men. That
Melissa, I wasn't going to bring that up, but great, go for it.
Yeah. And it just, it at the time, it was really like, for me, I kept thinking like, do you really need to include that chapter? Like, is it, because I when he was struggling and putting this memoir together, I don't think I really appreciated, that how he felt, or how Asian American feel about growing up in white society. And also, penis size is, I guess, a part of that. So I wasn't really getting it at the time, but, I was like going along with it and being supportive, and, but then the book came out, and, Alex just heard from so many other Asian men who said, thank you for writing that book. It was really, I think the first in a line of more books to come out about Asian American men. But Alex always said, his advice to writers was always to write the book that you wanted to read growing up, or that you want to read. And so this is something that he wished that he had when he was growing up. And I've, read other books this past year that hit on similar chords. So like one of them is Joe Coy, the Filipino comedian. He has a memoir out, and he touches on so many of the same things that are in Alex's book. And then David Chang, the chef, he has a wonderful book out this year as well, that it's also just like really similar themes. And so I think Alex was really hitting on something. And it was just, it's just really cool to see that he was before his time.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about this book, like this year, there's been so much around Asian American hate crimes. And, this book touches on it. There's in this chapter that you read, he references an item, and I'll just read part of it. He says, a news item out of Detroit in the summer of 1982, the murder of Vincent Chin. It made an impact on us all. And it's a story of Chin was Chinese, but in Detroit at the time, there was a lot of backlash against the Japanese because of the Japanese auto industry. And so he wasn't Chinese, but, for his attackers, he fit the bill. Anger at the Japanese spilled onto anyone who looked Japanese. And some scholars consider Chin's murder a watershed moment that gave rise to Asian America as a social entity. And then what I love is this line that he has where he says, behind it all was a keen awareness that it could have been any one of us at that McDonald's that night. So he's writing about in 2015, he's writing about an incident that happened in 1982. And here we are in 2021, still dealing with many of the same issues.
Absolutely.
So so let's dive into you and I, this is our favorite story. It's the quirkiest, but it's just so well done. So I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, great. And also, we should tell the audience if anybody has any questions they want to submit. We've got a couple already, but please feel free to do that. Here we go. Oh, wait a minute. No, wrong story. Here we go. The dateline for this was Honolulu. If Jesus were alive today, he would be a surfer. He would mingle with fishermen and beach bums and lay his mat on the sand among the scantily clad. Instead of walking on water, he would ride waves on a carved piece of fiberglass, keeping an eye out for anyone who needed saving. This is what Dean Sabate and his friends believe. They are surfers for Jesus. Today, they are on Waikiki Beach doing what they believe Jesus would be doing. While others might see a frolicking crowd, Sabate and his group see sprinkled among these masses a few lost souls who need tending. Quote, "This is our ministry, being out here, being in the ocean, making friends," says Sabate 42. He is a former pro surfer, muscular and bronzed. "We don't go thumping people on the head with a Bible. We come out here, enjoy the water, and talk to people," he says. "We just allow God to work." Lost souls include the lonely, the poor, the hopeless, and the worn out. And these are plentiful in paradise, though they're not always easy to spot. In Sabate's experience, those who seem together may be the least together people on the beach. You can hide a lot of sadness behind a pair of shades. I'll stop there, but it is beautifully written throughout. And as I referenced earlier, he obviously treated these subjects with a great deal of respect in writing about them. The story has humorous moments. The surfers are able to sort of make fun of themselves a little bit as well. But more fundamentally, he really does sort of examine, if Christ came back today, who would he be hanging out with? It wouldn't be hanging out with, wealthy folks in the top of a skyscraper in New York City. He'd be hanging out maybe with a lot of folks like this.
Yeah, I think another thing that really strikes me about this story is that, on the face of it, it seems like it's a story about religion, but this story just has a very spiritual vibe to it throughout. And I think, like part of Alex seeking out people like this is, his own kind of, trying to get to his own spiritual understanding. And, so I think a lot of the things that he wrote about and the people who he wanted to cover were things that he wanted to learn more about and was curious about just for his own personal journey. And so I think that was part of the attraction to this story. You were working with him at the LA Times at the time. Do you know how he even got this story, like how he convinced his editors to?
Well, actually, I think unlike some stories of his, he really had to kind of push to get them to see that it was a story and to accept it as a story. I think Surfers for Jesus, I don't think was a hard sell initially. And I'm sure that in the news, conference editors sort of sat around and said, "Oh, like, hey, that sounds like a funny story," but he came back with a serious story, which is the thing that was so great. And he was always coming back with the story that you wouldn't expect. And the story that sort of really delved behind the surface of things. One story that he did that was remarkable to me was about a criminal. And criminals, to some degree, can be invisible, obviously, once they're incarcerated. But this was a story about a horrible killing that, again, anybody who lives in Seattle for any length of time may remember this, but just a senseless drive-by shooting that killed a girl at Ballard High School. And it was a tragedy on two levels. Hers, the great tragedy of her losing her life, when she still is in high school and has so much of it to live. But the young man who did this, it was basically the first time he handled a gun, and he kind of fired it by accident. He's responsible for her death. He'll be in prison for a long, long, long time. But his life is also a tragedy. And Tizon really made an effort to try to understand this kid. And you don't read the story, I think, and it wasn't a sob story where you felt, oh, this kid has been railroaded by the system or by society. He shouldn't be in prison. You don't really, at least I didn't conclude that. He belongs in prison because he was responsible for this terrible death. But you can also see the tragedy behind his loss of life too. We all have done incredibly stupid things, especially as teenagers. Few of us do things that are as stupid and as tragic as that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that is one of my favorite stories. In fact, I was going to suggest that be one of the 4 that we talked about, but I wasn't sure that we would have time for it. At the time, Alex was actually doing a lot of stories about Southeast Asian gangs in the Seattle area. So this was like in the 90s, in the mid 90s. He was going like undercover. He always looked young. So he was able to like pass himself off as
better that he go undercover with Asian gangs than I do, I think.
Yeah. And so he just really immersed himself into it. And for this particular story, it was interesting years later. Do you remember that podcast called Serial?
Mm-hmm.
Alex was really into that, and it had kind of a similar feel to it, because Alex was interviewing somebody who was in jail, and trying to piece everything together. So,
wow. So one question we have, which is actually answered in the full length of the Lola article, but maybe you want to just comment on it because somebody is curious. How did Tizon's birth mother, who lived in the same house, obviously, how did she feel about Lola? What was the relationship between the two of them like? Alex writes about that at great length, but go ahead and tell us.
Yeah, it was a love-hate relationship. They had spent almost their entire lives together. I think Lola came into Letty is Alex's mom's name. Came into her life at a very, very young age. So Lola was basically a mother to Letty.
Lola was like a wedding. Lola was a wedding gift to her, right? Or
yeah. So it was a love-hate relationship. You talk about how Alex treated when he wrote about his subjects, he treated all of them with respect. He really did that. And what's unique about this story, the Lola story, is that he doesn't treat he's kind of no holds barred about his mom, like how his anger towards his mom just really comes through in the story. And you don't see him do that in any of his other essays or articles that he wrote, because he treats everybody like so tenderly. And this one, it was just, the amount of anger he had towards her towards the end of his life. It really comes through.
He also did try to understand what her perspective was and why she made the decisions that she did. She was out working for the family. His father was not fully present, and so sometimes it was on the mother to bring home a paycheck.
Mm-hmm.
But his mother grew sort of embittered in her own way and very jealous in a way of Lola, and she knew that Lola was more of a mother figure to her kids and to Tizon in particular than she was. And that must have been very, very painful for her. And I think that came through in the story.
Yeah, it definitely did.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I jump to another topic, Sam?
No, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you as a former journalist, or still a journalist and a writer, for people who are like wanting to go into journalism, or people who are practicing now, is there this space and the opportunity to be able to do this kind of journalism still? Like, I mean, does it exist? Like, well, I mean, the Atlantic is a unique location.
The Atlantic and the New Yorker to some degree are, and Harper's sometimes. There's a magazine called The Sun that's quite interesting. That those all will do various forms of so-called long-form journalism. I also think that the podcast is an interesting sort of phenomenon. It's basically radio, but it's radio in a long form, and especially the serialized episodes have really allowed some very creative and terrific reporters to tell stories in great ways. The thing that we're missing is, you know, back in the day, every city of any size had a newspaper, and the newspaper was generally kind of rolling in dough. Classified ads were 40%, even 50% of some newspapers' revenues. I tell my kids that when I moved to my first city after college, you know, you would look for your job in the newspaper. You would look for a car in the newspaper. You look for your apartment, and that's all got blown up by some guy named Craig. And, you know, obviously the world changes. What's sad about the decline of so many great daily newspapers is, in many cases, the first thing that's cut is the sort of long form journalism in which Tizon excelled. He was not, a lot of newspapers now, I know this firsthand, will keep spreadsheets of exactly how many stories a reporter has written and how many inches each one is and how many were on the front page and this and that. And, you know, Tizon might be gone 6 months on a story or a year, but he would come back with an amazing story. And there just are very, very few outlets now in the newspaper business that can support that kind of reporting. So I hope, I get it that newspapers themselves, especially the idea of, you know, going into a forest and chopping down trees and trucking it into a city and printing the thing up and driving around to people's houses, no problem with that sort of going the way of the horse and buggy. What pains me is that it hasn't quite been replaced yet by the equivalent vehicle for telling long stories. It's great that we all get our news on the phone, but you're not going to read an Alex Tizon story on the phone and get it. It's just true. So.
Yeah, and I like what you bring up about podcasts, because I think there is an opportunity there to tell longer stories, just because people like expect to hear the next episode of a podcast.
Yep.
And, you know, when Alex was teaching at the University of Oregon at the journalism school, that was one of the main classes that he was teaching. It was a class that they called Gateway, but it was showing the journalism students how to use multimedia to tell stories. Because like when I went to journalism school, and probably you too, like you had to choose your track, like you're going to be in newspapers or magazines or broadcast. But, you know, now it was this holistic approach, and you learned how to like use multimedia to tell your story. So hopefully there are more people who are exploring podcasts as a way to get some of these stories out there. And I do have one more question for you, Sam, as the editor of this book, is just Alex had such a knack for finding stories and identifying what would be a good story. Like, did you like figure out like how he did it? I mean, is there a secret magic formula?
You and I would be sort of weirdly, uniquely in a position to know the answer to this question. You obviously more than anybody, because you lived with him. I, because I did work with him, and we obviously had many, many days when we were in the office together. It was not an easy process, and he would sometimes really suffer with a story, and he would feel that he didn't have the story, or that he wasn't writing it the right way. And you know, for a lot of us in journalism, like when the story isn't going well, we sort of focus it on ourselves, like, you know, oh, this is going to be really bad for me, or my editor is, you know, going to wonder why he can't write, or, you know, why the story isn't ready. For Tizon, it was more that he felt, I'm not doing justice to the person that I'm writing about. Almost every story that he did, that was that person's really one shot at fame or having their life story told. Unlike, again, a politician where somebody might be doing a profile, but 200 other people are going to do a profile. his profile was going to be the one and only story, the epic story of this person. And he really, really took it seriously upon himself. He had a wonderful story about a guy who was a janitor in a high school, but also kind of a writer on the side. And lo and behold, the janitor gets a story published in the New Yorker. And again, the story that most of us would do is to go and interview this janitor. And it's like you're interviewing a guy who's won the lottery or something, like, you know, tell us how you did this. And isn't it wonderful? And isn't life great? And in fact, what Tizon quickly figured out is the guy sort of caused a massive personality crisis for the guy, you know, like sort of a little bit of imposter syndrome, a little bit of, but I can never write another story again because I can't write it as well as I happen to write that one story. And he turned the whole thing into sort of this meditation about the creative process and about sort of some of the suffering that goes into it. So he suffered a lot for his work. I'm sure that you as his wife would have loved for him to figure out a way to suffer less, but
yeah, I mean, and I'm sure Lisa, as your wife, has probably gone through some of the same things. But he did struggle, and he really had stressed out about stories. And, you know, now that we're talking, I realize, like, because he was taking these huge risks, like telling these stories that could have like completely gone, you know, flopped. So I can understand that, like, you know, writing a story about Christian surfers for the front page of the LA Times, which is one of the biggest publications in the US. That's a huge risk. So, you know, I can understand where he was feeling the pressure and the heat.
Yeah. Well, he was a master at pulling off those stories. They were called, I'm not sure if they still have the feature, but it was called Column 1. Yeah. And it was usually the story on the front page that ran almost at magazine length. And he had tons of those. He was not, again, a big fan of doing, you know, daily breaking news stories, but he was just a master of that form. By the way, one question we had, and then I know we have to wrap up, is somebody wants to know whether, if he was alive, did he have other books in him? And if so, do you know what they were going to be about?
Yeah, he wanted to write about the Maguindanao Massacre in the Philippines. So it was 30 journalists. They were covering a political election in the southern part of the Philippines, and they were murdered, mass murdered in broad daylight as a show of force to the political opposition. And Alex was in the Philippines at that time, and I remember hearing the news, and I was worried that he was there. But anyway, that was the next story that he wanted to write. Just because, you know, like, we take the free press for granted here in the United States, but in the Philippines, people die for trying to cover things and bring light to things. So that would have been the next one. And I know we're out of time, but I wanted to just share one more thing. Is just that, you know, again, we were talking about how Alex really respected the subject. He wanted to treat them with respect. He really cared about them and wanted to do justice. I think the other great thing is, like, when a story would publish and he would hear from the person who he wrote about, it just really made his day. And so, you know, like, his stories were usually Sunday stories. And when they came out, like, he would be reading the paper and reading the story over and over. Like we all would. We would just be reading the story over and over again. And then he'd start getting like emails and phone calls from people who just like wanted to tell him what they thought about the story. And he just loved that kind of like engagement and that reaction. And he just loved hearing from people. I think it fueled him to keep going and keep telling these stories that nobody else was telling.
Oh, that's great.
So anyway, I think that we are right at time. Yeah. So
thank you to everybody who's tuning in.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
And I just want to say on behalf of Town Hall, a huge thank you to both of you. Melissa, Sam, thank you for sharing, and thank you for spending this evening with us. And thank you to everyone at home watching, and hope everyone has a great night. And do not forget to pick up a copy of the book through our partner bookseller, Elliott Bay Book Company. Thanks again. Good night.
Thank you.